Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Business Disability Forum's Global Conference, Creating a Disability Smart World Together. My name's Dan Cadey, Senior Business Partner at BDF, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and fellow Senior Business Partner, Mary Worsley. I am a white man who probably needs a haircut, wearing a blue shirt in front of a display of the Business Disability Forum offices. I'll let Mary describe herself. I think that's only polite. We'll be joining you throughout today's event, but before we kick off in earnest, we've got a few notes on housekeeping to help you get the most out of today's sessions. First of all, the conference will run from 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. UK time, and then again from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. So you can choose to join any session that suits you best wherever you are in the world. For optimal viewing, we recommend using Google Chrome, Safari, or Firefox. BSL and live captions are available throughout. They'll be included on screen for the full duration of the event. And if you want to see more of us, the screen can be increased by clicking on the enlarge icon, and video quality can be lowered or increased by clicking the cog icon. Most importantly, your questions and comments. We'll be using Slido throughout the event, and you can comment and join the conversation in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Or if you prefer and you'd like to view a larger version in another window or on another device, just visit slido.com and enter the code hashtag 3363989.
Thanks, Dan, and hi everyone. Really glad to be here. I'm helping Dan host this today. And for description purposes, I'm a white woman with short brown hair and multicoloured highlights, and I'm wearing a purple shirt in aid of International Day. We have some great topics today, some really good speakers, some really good panels. So I hope you're going to have a really great morning. It would be great if you can share the event on social media using the hashtag Disability Smart World. That would be really cool if you could share that around. The meeting is being recorded, and a video recording of the full event will be made available following the conference. We will be sharing a link to the feedback survey at the end of the conference, and we'd really love to know your thoughts. So please fill that in at the end if you can. We'd also like to really gauge what you'd like to hear more about in the future. So please just take a couple of minutes to do that. We'd also love to know where you're joining from. This is obviously a global conference, so you want to know which parts of the globe we're covering today. So feel free to just pop a comment in Slido to tell us where you're joining from. So let's get started. We'd like to hand over now to Diane for the CEO address.
Thank you, Dan and Mary, and a very warm welcome from me to the first session of our global conference sponsored by our good friend and partner HSBC. And if you can't see me, or even if you can, I'm a 49-year-old, a proud 49-year-old white woman, and I'm wearing a black velvet jacket, and I'm also wearing the only purple item I could find in my wardrobe, which is a sort of patterned lilac-ish sort of silk scarf in aid of course, the United Nations Day of Persons with Disabilities on the 3rd of December. So today is a day of two halves, if not a game of two halves. Repeating the format we trialled back in April, we're running sessions in the AM and PM in terms of UK and European time to cover the same content so that you can access it wherever you are in the world. And of course, this part of our global agenda for 2022 is timed deliberately to coincide with the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities. It's a time to come together and highlight issues facing people with disabilities globally, and also to celebrate. So what's on our agenda today? Those of you who were with us in April will remember that we started a conversation on language, on how we talk about disability globally. It sparked quite a debate, and it was clear in that discussion and in many others since that there is a real appetite for looking at how we talk about disability. Indeed, talking about disability and normalising the conversation is absolutely critical in developing global disability inclusion strategies. Senior leaders are even more crucial in shaping a narrative of what matters round here. And we see time and time again that a visible and active senior champion makes a huge difference in driving real change. And we're lucky enough to have quite a few of them with us today. The platform that senior leaders occupy and their profile have a huge impact. But for many leaders, this can mean that the stakes simply feel too high and the risk of getting it wrong just too great, which too often means they say nothing. It's not surprising, therefore, that the subject of language is one that frequently comes up at our CEO and C-suite roundtables. And with the language around disability constantly evolving, we know it could be difficult to know where to start. Language that works in one situation and place may not work in another. At the same time, organisations also need to think about the language they use within their brand. What messages are they giving out to disabled people about their values? So today I'm very pleased that we're launching our 4th global guide in a suite kindly sponsored by HSBC. It's called Lost in Translation, a global guide to the language of disability. And it calls on businesses to break down barriers by engaging in conversations about disability at an individual and organisational level. The guide provides really practical advice on reviewing and discussing language and introducing positive change. We really hope it will help you start a conversation about disability and to co-produce solutions that are right for you. The guide is freely available to all for the next month on our Knowledge Hub and via the What's New link on the main BDF homepage. We'll also be hearing from the guide's author, our very own Jean Tennant, a little later on. Jean will be explaining the need for this report, the challenges of taking on such a task, and sharing key highlights. And today we're looking not just at language, but also at the language of loss. It's fair to say that it has been a turbulent few years with Brexit, COVID, the cost of living crisis, climate change, and of course, the war in Ukraine. Globally, many of us and our employees have experienced a huge amount of loss. How are they coping with that? How can global businesses support employees, particularly in the context of different cultural norms? We'll be joined by panellists from different countries and very different cultures who will be sharing their thoughts on how global businesses who are operating in diverse cultures navigate this language of loss and their views on what organisations need to be thinking about. We'll also be looking at employee wellbeing and how to take the temperature of your global workforce in our How Are You Feeling panel, which looks at the growing appetite amongst employers for collecting information and statistics about their workforce. This, of course, links to language too. Many businesses want to gain a picture of the number of employees with disabilities in their workforce, but you can only measure in a meaningful way if you have a clear definition or agreed sense of what disability means in your business. That's not always straightforward in a single country business. Layer on the complexities of a global business with not only very different cultural approaches to talking about disability, but which work in countries in which the word disability is not used or where there is no direct translation, and it becomes even more complicated. Some disabled employees are beginning to push back on this. Why do employers want to know? This panel also considers the specific cultural challenges of supporting conversations around mental health in countries where you can or can't blend the personal and the professional. And it asks, is it time to lose the labels? Speaking of labels, neurodiversity is increasingly going up the agenda, with a growing number of global businesses realising they need the skills and perspectives of people who quite literally think differently. And that's great to see. But how do you get the support right? We're very pleased to be joined this morning by Aidan Healy from Lexic, who will be sharing his expert advice. And last but not least, I'm joined in conversation with John McAlalisi, Global Head of ESG at KPMG, to talk about the trends in ESG reporting he is seeing, going beyond compliance and what transformational leadership looks like in this space. We'll also be talking about how tackling disability inclusion and climate change are not and must not be an either or, and the importance of getting the right voices and lived experiences around the table. Now, I mentioned celebration. And today I'm delighted to officially launch our 2023 Disability Smart Awards, which are now open for entries, sponsored by our partner Microlink. If you're proud of something your organisation has done to support disability inclusion, we want to hear from you. This is your opportunity to share what you've been doing to improve experiences of your disabled employees and customers, and receive the recognition you deserve for it. Our Disability Smart Awards are open to all UK and global organisations of any size, from any sector, and are free to enter. You don't even have to be a BDF member, though why on earth wouldn't you be? Award categories include inclusive product design, recruitment, communication, customer service, learning and development, workplace experience, technology, and more. And there are 3 additional awards for organisations signed up to the Disability Confidence Scheme. Please do look on our website for details, and I'm sure that one of my lovely colleagues will be posting the link in the chat. Our conference title today is Creating a Disability Smart World Together. It's also our strapline, and it's our strapline for a reason. It's only by working together that we will find solutions and make these sometimes radical changes that are needed to transform disability inclusion in businesses and for people around the world. It is all of our responsibility, just as climate changes, and we can all do our bit. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, our sponsor, Carolanne Minashi, Global Head of Inclusion at HSBC. HSBC is a long-standing friend and partner and deeply committed to disability inclusion. As I mentioned, they're the sponsor of our Global Guide series and so much more. So we're delighted to be partnering with you once again. Carolanne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diane. It's such a pleasure to be here. Let me just describe myself. So I am a 56-year-old menopausal lady who has now officially run out of year. I'm slightly horrified that it's the 1st of December today. I certainly have more than 1 month's worth of work to get through. I'm sure lots of you can identify with that. I've got blonde hair. I'm white in terms of my ethnic identity, and today I am wearing a navy blue top. As Diane said, I am Global Head of Inclusion at HSBC, and I'm just absolutely delighted to be able to just say a few words at the top of our time together. HSBC has been a very long-standing and committed partner to the Business Disability Forum, and that it's a very important and special relationship for us. So number one, it is about working with, some absolute experts who can support us on our own journey, and just having a group of people at the end of the phone where we can say, look, we're struggling with this, or we're thinking about this idea, has just been enormously beneficial to us as practitioners. I think equal to that benefit is the benefit of working with colleagues like the ones we're going to hear from today, that create together a community of practitioners that can share the challenges, share the successes, learn from each other. This is not the topic to be competitive about when it comes to employment. So we have benefited greatly from learning from the other members, and very happy to share back probably more of the things where we've got it wrong than our successes, but it's that community that holds us together. We're particularly delighted to sponsor the series of papers that we have, but this one in particular is much, much needed. As Diane mentioned, words matter. And as I was reflecting, reading the report and reflecting, there's a symmetry for me around having this conversation now and the conversation that organisations were trying to have when the tragic murder of George Floyd happened, a few years ago. And what's similar about it is what I observed was it was a crisis situation that happened, and it was a crisis for not a good reason. But organizations were almost paralyzed by not having the right language to start to talk about race and ethnicity in the workplace. And that fear of getting it wrong, the fear of saying the wrong thing, in fact, in the early days outweighed the push to want to start the conversation and want to open up. And I was in a different organization at the time, but very linked with community practitioners. I think we all felt the same thing, which is we have to support our workforce, our seniors, our stakeholders with the language to help them start to have the conversation, because without having the conversation, no progress really can be made. And so getting the stakeholder group, particularly seniors, to a place where we were basically saying, actually, you know, you'll be forgiven for not using the completely correct word, but what you won't be forgiven for is not engaging in the conversation. And I feel that today we're sort of in the same place with this piece of work around disability. Language matters massively, and people are very well intended to want to move into this space and start to explore the very many areas that we need to do better. But they're worried, they don't have the right language, they don't want to offend. And so sometimes human nature is, it's easier to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. And that's what this guide does. It gives us incredibly practical, pragmatic solutions that help give people a little bit of comfort and a little bit of ease. I think the other thing that I particularly like about this work is the understanding that language around disability is nuanced and it differs contextually depending on the environment that you're in. And I think that's really positive. So I'm very, very grateful for BDF and Jean in particular for authoring this and putting this on the table. I think it's going to have a multi-year benefit to us as a practitioner community. So really, that's all I wanted to say. I'm so looking forward to all the conversations today. I think every time we meet as a community, we get stronger as a community, and there is still so much to be done. So with that, I think, Daniel, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Thank you, Carolanne. And yes, certainly everything you said there about starting to engage in conversations really resonates with everything that I'm hearing from partners that I'm speaking to every single day. Before we start our next session, news just in, I knew I was asked to wear this headset for a reason, but on Slido, apparently anyone who's having any trouble with Slido, it should now be at the bottom of your feed, and you might need to refresh your page if it isn't working for you, or open another tab, and that should get things started. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Now on to our first session, which actually begins with a short film.
Gestremdheid.
Handicap.
Deficiência.
障害
Ayogyata. Funktionsnedsättning. Zdravotné postihnutie.
Behinderung.
Discapacidad.
Kurang upaya.
Handicap.
身心障碍.
Недееспособность.
Handicap.
Disabilità. Mazuri.
Niepełnosprawność. Wymytość.
Disabilitate.
Invalidnost.
So for description purposes, the slide that we just showed displayed the word disability in multiple languages. And that's because today, as you've heard, we are launching our new global guide, Lost in Translation, sponsored again by HSBC, providing a deep dive into the language of disability around the world. And as you've already heard, glad to say that BDF's own Jean Tennant is here with us, and she had the not unsubstantial task of writing a report. She's with us today to tell us a little bit more about it, some of the key highlights and some of the challenges in approaching such an important and sizable subject. So hello and welcome, Jean.
Hello, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Caroline, for such lovely comments. Thank you.
It's great to see you, Jean. Can you first of all tell us a little bit about the motivators for writing this guide, and then why we felt that there was a need for it?
Shall I do a wee description of what I look like first?
Go on then, yeah.
I'll just scare everybody. I am a white woman. I've got dark, very unruly bobbed brown hair, and I wear glasses, and the nearest colour I've got to purple is blue, so that's what I'm wearing today. So I'll move on to your question. The motivators, as Diane mentioned in her introduction, the last conference, there was a debate about language and the passion and the enthusiasm for it, and the need for it really came to the fore, and that's really what sort of launched the need for the guide. So it's, that really highlighted the importance of it. Is there a need for it? Absolutely. I know from my previous career, before coming to BDF, that a lot of managers at various levels and individuals talking to their friends, family, team members, were really nervous about talking about disability, what language. They're really frightened about offending people. And I was the same. Actually, writing this report, I was really, really conscious of my language use, and I've learned an awful lot, so thank you. So yes, there's a big need for it at local and at global levels. And finally, as Carolanne was mentioning, disability as far as language goes is probably the poor relative in this. Gender and race are further along the line on this, and we can probably learn a lot from them, and from the experience of writing those guides, because they did start so much earlier, and I think we can probably catch up a lot quicker. But there is a real benefit. We, as disability and language, we are a little bit behind. So yes, a big need for it, absolutely.
Yeah, totally agree. I remember that session from the last conference, one of those ones where you think, well, we could have probably just had 3 days alone, at least just on that conversation. And we've hinted at some of the complexities around the subject just in our introduction. So I wondered what for you were the challenges in writing the guide.
Oh, they were enormous. For starters, where do you start with something like this? It's huge. Language is huge, and it's a topic that's not really, my key remit. I come from a health background. Medical language and is what I'm coming from, and so learning all about the nuances and the different cultures and everything else was just huge. Absolutely fascinating. I loved every minute of this. I could write books on this. I've become very passionate about it, and I will speak faster as the passion comes through. So yes, so it was big. Looking at it, just even just with English, it was just huge. And knowing where to start was a really big challenge for me, and I'm sure that would be the same actually for anybody starting this. Where do you start? And I would say really get what you're aiming to get with your guide written, and I think that will make it much easier. Lesson learned from me. I went big and then came small.
It's known, it seems, the size, but again, that nuance around people, be it in other subjects, you might know whether there's a right or a wrong answer, but it always seems when we talk about disability, there's so many different opinions and so many different ways to say a thing. But as well as, I was just going to say, as well as mentioning the size of the topic, how is it not possible to cover everything? And expand a little bit on what the guide is able then to do and what it's not really meant to do.
What it's not able to do is really give you a list, a definitive list of what to use and what not to use. As has already been alluded to, language is changing all the time. So there's no way of catching up with, with the current trends. That would be a full-time job in itself. And we did just concentrate on English, because to try and talk about how you translate that into other languages would just be, one, it's beyond my capability, but two, it is just so complex, and the best people to do that are the people who are locally based for whatever languages are there. So yeah, I would say definitely. That's what's not in it. There is a lot of help in it. I hope that people will find useful. And one of the things is knowing who to ask and where to get the help from. And I think that's probably a big fear that people have when they are starting this. And it was certainly one that I had. And but actually it was an unfounded fear. We sort of put the message out there that we're doing it, and the amount of offers of help that came my way, the steering group, I can't thank the steering group enough, and our BDF colleagues, the offers of help, the quality of that help, and the passion and the volume of it was phenomenal. And actually I ended up with the challenge of having so much information. How do I cut it down? So if anybody's doing this for themselves, ask around, because people in your organizations will be desperate and really enthusiastic to help you. And that was something I really learned from it, but it was a challenge at the start. Where do I start with this? Who do I ask? And how do I ask? Especially, very senior people. It can be a bit sort of like, is it okay to interrupt them and ask them? And the other big challenge, I think, and other learning is trying to keep it short and sweet and relevant to everybody. I mean, I got quite passionate about this. I got into every deep rabbit hole you could possibly find. Excuse me a minute. Just out of interest. And then, of course, I wanted to put that information into the report or into the guidance, but just try and keep it really relevant to the groups that you're doing it. And remember that, what is relevant to senior leadership team is not the same as going to be relevant to somebody working at a very local level. A one-to-one manager, having a conversation, or, somebody just coming into a business and that sort of stuff. It's going to be very, very different. So yeah. Absolutely.
And it is a fantastic piece of work. I mean, it does sound an awful lot as well like it is about getting confidence in approach. What you're saying, it's almost like the experience you've had is almost a microcosm of what we're talking about getting some sort of confidence in the approach rather than trying to find exact terms for every individual as well. We have time, Jane. So finally, just what 3 tips would you give to our audience to take away from today?
I think I've already sort of alluded to some of them, but don't let fear stop you from starting this. Ask away. If you're not sure what language to use or how to put stuff across, ask people. Want to help you through this journey. The worst thing you can do is absolutely nothing. So ask for help, listen and learn, and apologize if you get it wrong, and accept that you're not going to keep everybody happy 100% of the time. Include everybody when you're designing this guide. If you're a global organization, you want feedback from a global organization, and obviously this is about disability, so include people with disabilities in this. As the saying goes, with us, not for us, and allow flexibility in your guides. There's going to be local nuances, cultures, things like that, so incorporate that into your guide and accept that. And those would really be my 3, and enjoy the process. I really enjoyed it once I got into it, and I'm sure everybody will do as well.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Jean. And yeah, congratulations again. It's a fantastic piece of work, and I'm sure it's going to be useful to everyone who's watching today. So the HSBC Global Language Guide available now. You can find it either on our website in the Knowledge Hub in the resources section under the title Lost in Translation, a global guide to language of disability. And I'm sure it will be put into the link in the chat as well. So it's open to everyone until the end of December, after which it will become one of our partner-only resources. So thank you again, Jean. And now I'd like to welcome back Mary to the virtual floor for the next session.
Hello. hopefully you can all hear me. I think I'm here. Yeah. Great. So so thanks, Dan and Jean. I think that sounds amazing. And having seen parts of that in its construction, I would heavily recommend you take a look at that. So now I'm pleased to move on to our first panel discussion of the day. I'm really excited that we've got a really interesting panel today. I'm going to be joined by Monika Jankowski-Rangelov from State Street in Poland, Lynn Lee from Shell in Singapore, and Srila Dasgupta from Tata in India. I'll allow them to introduce themselves a little bit more in a moment, but I just want to start by giving you a bit of context to the panel discussion today. So Diane mentioned a little bit of this earlier, and it's definitely fair to say that over the last few years, we have all been touched by loss in lots of ways. The loss of loved ones, loss of routines, what is familiar in our lives, our social interactions with our friends and family, as well as illness, disability, and forced changes to how we work, whether that's home, office or hybrid. Everything feels different. Mourning this loss and these different types of loss, providing a bit of an uncertainty about what the future will look like, it has changed priorities of employees, and this is having a significant impact on businesses around the world. Companies are trying to balance the lives, which is sometimes seen as a gain from an employee point of view, because in some respects they are taking back some control. It's also seen as potentially a change, or in some cases a loss to customers and consumers who are having to also change the way that they perhaps consumed products and services maybe a few years ago. So there's a lot going on, and I think it's the one thing that is definitely happening globally, and everyone is being affected. So what we'd like to hear from the panel today is their thoughts on how global businesses who are operating in diverse cultures navigate this language of loss. What are their views on organisations and what they need to be thinking about? How is that employee landscape changing? We will be discussing the mental health aspects in the panel a bit later on, so we're not really going into the mental health piece of employees, but what we're looking to understand is what, as a business, you can do to understand these changing priorities and continue to engage with employees in perhaps a different way. So, as I say, I'm really pleased to introduce the panel. So, going around the screen, my screen, I'm not sure if you have the same order. I'd like to introduce Lynn Lee, who's the Chief Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Officer at Shell and in Singapore. So welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. I'm really pleased to be in this conference, and maybe let me start by introducing myself. So I am a Singaporean of Chinese ethnicity. I have long brown hair and dark brown eyes, quite fair, I think, and I've had some makeup on. I have a lavender colored linen blouse, which I am recycling, so I wore the same blouse last. So it's good that I could find it. Yeah, so very happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And then I'm also happy to introduce Srila Dasgupta, Lead SME, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Supplier Diversity at Tata Consultancy Services in India. Welcome, Srila. It's really great you can join us this morning. Okay, I think we might be on mute, Srila.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joined. Lovely to be on this panel, and I am from India. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And today I am wearing black with a red scarf. I'm of Indian ethnic origin, and I have graying dark hair. I'm 56 years old. I have a red dot on my forehead, and I'm wearing glasses. And I want to wish everybody a very, very happy International Day of Persons with Disability.
Thank you, Srila. Great to have you. And last but by no means least, I'll introduce you to Monika. So Monika is on my other page. So Monika Jankowska-Rangelov is Inclusion and Diversity Head for EMEA Vice President at State Street in Poland. So obviously an area that is having a lot of change and activity right now. So it'd be really great to hear your views, Monika. Monica, but would you just like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. As Mary mentioned, I'm based in Poland and I'm sitting in my home office in Krakow. I'm a blonde woman in my early 40s, wearing today a white and blue striped shirt, sitting in my home office, as mentioned, on a blue chair. So when it comes to what you mentioned, Mary, Poland is quite specific, so I'm happy to really share our very recent experiences of a loss nearby Ukraine.
Great, thank you, Monica. So let's get on with the show. So Lynn, if I can come to you first, I think we can agree that loss is universal. We've spoken a bit about that already. And there are many ways this is dealt with differently around the world. So can you just give us a little bit of a flavour for what Shell are doing to help employees wherever they might be based, and to share sort of how they're feeling about the losses that I mentioned in the introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And I just wanted to reiterate what you had mentioned before, that when we are talking about loss, it's different aspects of loss. It's the loss of independence in which we have known. It's also the loss of the way in which we used to work. Yeah, but I think more importantly as well is the loss perhaps of physical health, loss of mental well-being, loss of a loved one. So I think, there are many layers of loss that we're talking about. Yeah, so I think, the very first thing for a company like Shell, when we're talking about providing support to employees, the first thing that we think of, which is foundational, is around building trust, yeah, and creating and building emotional capital, yeah, because that's foundational, yeah, in terms of addressing needs, because as we've mentioned before, and as we all know and experience, this is multifaceted, yeah, and each one of us comes with our own perspective and experience of loss that may not be able to be accommodated through a standardized process or a standardized approach, and it has to be bespoke. Yeah, and when I say bespoke, I mean much more in terms of the way in which employees would feel the experience. Yeah, so I mean, trust is hard to build, but breaking trust is easy, right? And I think especially in a company's perspective, it has to be felt in terms of the practical support. So, for example, in a place like Shell, we obviously have quite a robust mental health support with our health colleagues across the world. So when it comes to mental well-being, lots of supporting materials around resilience. And we look at this much more in terms of building resilience, which is resources that we provide and amplify and ask for staff to self-help, basically. Yeah, that's the first level of help. I think, many times as well, it could be much more in terms of providing capacities and capabilities for line managers, perhaps, to have the language around how to support. Yeah, and I think it's also then creating supporting systems around allyship, ambassadors who are able to notice colleagues or staff who may need more help, who may not be able to articulate. Yeah, and I think lastly, providing support in terms of professional help. Yeah, if it's perhaps maybe not a loss of mental health in terms of, let's say, the pandemic or a recent event, but perhaps a long challenge, physical or mental health, where support is needed. Yeah, and I think then that professional help, which may not be able to be supported in the organization. So I think making sure that this is sound, making sure that people do get the support and that they do feel like they're not stigmatized if they ask for that support. Yeah, and making sure that this is the common language across. Yeah, so I think that is an example around how a company like Shell is providing support in terms of addressing this huge topic around handling loss.
Yeah, definitely, and there's a good lot of stuff there needing to be done, I think, to support them. And it'd be interesting just to know, Lynn, are obviously you've got a lot of things in place to try and help that. Are you seeing employees asking for that proactively, sort of coming to you and saying we need something to help, and sort of coming and asking you for specifics around
yes, I think more and more so, I would say that in the past few years, again, very much amplified by just a lot more awareness around mental health, resilience, well-being. So I do see that, firstly, a lot more information is being provided. But secondly, I think people are just more willing to ask for help. Yeah. And I think especially then on, loss of independence, like I said, around, maybe not feeling mentally well, that I think is more common, and people feel like they can ask for help. I think where it's still probably a little bit more difficult would be in the physical or disability space. If a person has acquired a disability, I think it comes down to the fact that sometimes it is hard to ask for what you may require. If it's something which has been acquired, perhaps a disability acquired, as an example, because of illness, such as COVID. And I think sometimes when you acquire that, you may not always know what you require, and you may not know where to ask. So I think we're finding that in that aspect, it's a little bit more difficult. I think there is an opportunity for Shell, in terms of the feedback that we get, to be a lot more overt around signposting, making sure that people know where they can get help, how they can get help, helping as well, line managers be aware of what it is that we're signposting and how they can help as well. So I think I see the tide changing. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can do, but even just for this year around, conferences on International Day for persons with disabilities, we've seen a lot more interest around asking where the resources are and how I can get help. So I think good direction in terms of the right way that we're going. Much more that we can do. Great,
thanks, Lynn. And hold that thought, because I'm sure we'll get some questions later around that. So Srila, if I can come to you. So India has undoubtedly suffered terrible losses in the past few years that have affected the workforce, and I know we've talked a little bit about that in our pre-conversations. Could you share what you've seen in the way employees are reassessing their priorities and changing their behaviour, whether that's demanding more flexibility and control in their work or their personal life? Sorry, I can't hear you again, Srila.
I really am sorry, but yeah, I didn't get very far into what I was saying. One second. I'm so sorry. So one of the things that I think our organization, Tata Consultancy Services, is experiencing is probably a worldwide phenomenon for all employers. We are the IT wing of the Tata Group of companies. We have over 600,000 employees across 45 countries. And this has probably been one of the biggest levelers in changing the nature of workspaces and the way we are rethinking work. And what you said is absolutely right. I mean, a very large part of our workforce is in India. And the informal sector has really suffered great losses. And the formal sector has kind of, I think, taken a step back and very interestingly changed the drivers that were very critical for the way we navigate our workspaces, especially as we go up our career path. Post COVID, I think everybody's dealt with losses, and I agree with Lynn. It's not only loss of life; it is loss of the way we see our world, the way we interact with our world, the way we engage with each other, and that has kind of put people, I think, made people think and reflect on what do we really want out of life? What is it that makes us happy? What is it, am I going to be a CEO and that's going to make me happy, or do I want to spend time with my family? And I think it's also helped to break those very strong masculine referenced frameworks, which have always othered people who are not part of the heteronormative framework. And therefore, I think it has become kinder, it has become more inclusive. One of the values that we have in Tatas is inclusion, which is part of our ethos. But now I think we've started developing a stronger language around that. And when the reality is the fact that we have our employees saying that, even if I have a critical meeting, but I have to take my father for a checkup, I am going to take my father for a checkup, where somebody shared that, even 2 years back, I would not have done that. I would have told my family, I have a critical meeting and that is more important to my career. And that's how the priorities have changed. And people are, because of the unpredictability that we have faced, I think people want to live in the here and the now. And that's part of who we are becoming or want to be. And we want the respect to be given for that we as individuals want to prioritize the fact that that our loved ones are a very large part of who we are, and that really determines how we want to work, how our workspaces should be like, whether we want more flexible time, whether we want to have the organization give us skills which are related to resilience instead of related to technical growth. So I think there's a huge churn which is happening right now, and I think the linear delineation of how a career progresses, of what a workspace should be like, is the lines are completely blurred. I don't think any of us have found any answers as yet, but one of the things that I really felt is that the connect that people had, we have a very strong disability inclusion employee resource group network, which is both present in the global virtual space as well as in locations. But the power of the global virtual network was immense, because that is where people came together and shared experiences and were there support systems for each other, where they found their tribe. And that, I think, is something that organizations also need to probably recognize, that is where the language is going to emerge from. I really hope, and I think that I see the shift from a lens of sympathy really moving to a lens of empathy and inclusion, and I think that is really critical. So I think people are just completely recalibrating who they are and what they want out of life, which needs to be recognized. Otherwise, employers are going to be losing out on talent.
Absolutely. And do you feel that's something that's sort of here to stay as we come out of the last few years and into whatever the next few years hold, who knows, that this shift in kind of the balance of power almost is something that employers should be looking at? Actually, this is here to stay, and we need to really be rethinking some of our strategies.
I think I don't know whether it's going to stay in the exact form that we are seeing it now. I think one of the lessons that we've taken from the pandemic is nothing is predictable, and I don't think the human race should should actually drop its arrogance and say we know everything. We don't know anything. So even our coping mechanisms have to be constantly changing and adapting to change, because change is probably the only thing which is constant. And I think, but at this stage of time, I think we all employers realize that things have shifted and they're never going to go back. There's no elasticity here, that this was a before, this is like this after is going to map back to the before. It is not. The future of work is being constantly redefined. And I had my goddaughter who's 22 years old who was staying with me, and she's just came here for a job interview, and she said that she is going to take up the job. And I said, what is the main reason? She said, I think my employers are woke. So that's the language. And I said that, okay, I think I need to use this term when I go on to this panel today, that I think all employers need to be woke now. And I think our focus should be not dependent on how many people come back to office and how many hours we put in, but what is our productivity. We need to be impact based. We need to be productivity based. We need to be able to leverage our talent to the best of our ability, so that the contribution that they are making is something that we can kind of fly on. And because the talent is immense, we just have to kind of rework the way we harness that talent, and yes, be woke. So I don't know if that answers.
Thanks, Sheila. There's some really good points in there. And I'll just come on to now, Monica. So as we sort of mentioned, it feels like the power balance between employer and employees is shifting. What's seen as a loss for some is seen as a gain for others. Do we need to come to a new understanding between employer and employee about what is needed? And I guess also whether you have sort of perspective from obviously where you're sitting, you're seeing a very different landscape to maybe Lynn and Sheila. So it'd be really good to kind of hear what you're seeing and feeling from your employees right now.
Absolutely. So it very much strongly resonates what Sheila just said about, that we will never come back to the ways of working for our employers as we used to. Definitely, I think we are moving into more like collaboration way of working instead of being employed and doing what we are asked to do, the way the employer wants us to do. I think that there are multiple reasons. Of course, COVID has had a massive impact on how we perceive our employment generally, and what Sheila said, that prioritization of our family life, of our private sphere is so much important, and people have realized that at the end of the day, the family and our private life is much more important, because we can always change our job. And I think this is the clue. The employers, especially in Europe, in multiple locations, I know that this is the same case in UK, in Poland, and many other countries, the employers currently cannot afford losing people, and people are happy to and open to change their jobs, even sometimes changing the industry. For example, companies working in financial area are a little bit less open to, for example, working abroad because of multiple reasons like legislation or taxes, whereas IT allows that. So many people, I can clearly see the trend, are leaving financial industry, moving to IT, because IT allows you to work from Poland and work for America, or spend your life in Caribbean and work for Asian company. This is the freedom that people are starting to look for. They are expecting huge flexibility, being able to decide, what is the priority of the day, what they need to handle. They are happy to do the tasks, initiatives, programs, projects, but at their own pace. I think this approach very much supports also people with disabilities, because they can decide, how to organize their day, how to organize their breaks, rest, somehow re-energize for the rest of the day. And I think it's essential that people are looking for this balance also from the mental health. And as we mentioned, I'm based in Poland, which was severely impacted this year by the event in Ukraine, where Russia invaded the country that was very similar to Poland. Like we worked with Ukraine very closely. We had Ukrainians coming to Poland for work for the last decade. And suddenly, a very closely neighboring country was attacked. And there is a war, a very serious war. It had a massive impact on our employees, generally all the people in Poland, not only because we faced immigration and refugees crisis, because really hundreds of thousands of people were crossing the border, within a couple of weeks, and they continue to do so, especially right now when the winter is coming. It impacted our market as well in terms of employment. On the other hand, what we have observed is that the huge crisis among our employees of lack of feeling of security and safety. Suddenly people started to consider that they will leave everything what they have, including the job, and they will move out from Poland. They will move somewhere else where it will be physically safer, another country, another continent if needed. And multiple families started to have plan B, which is a packed backpack, a suitcase that they would take only the medicines, documents, and they will just go and leave if the war spreads. And exactly what we were saying, we don't know anything what's coming in the future, and the way to, I think, survive and build some kind of a own internal safety and feeling of being safe is exactly having these multiple options of choice, because we can't control such events, like pandemic or war. The only thing what we can do is just to think what we can control. And this is what the families also in Ukraine start to do, like moving the country, leaving the husbands, fathers, men there, and taking their children and moving out for saving their life, even not thinking about, prosperous life, but just saving their life. And I think this is very close to what generally people globally are perceiving at the moment, that it's so much important to take care of ourselves as employees, which puts the employers somehow, on a constant challenge. Because as Shrira mentioned, many people don't want to come back to the offices. Many companies have reduced their office spaces, even, like 50%. They sold it out or just rented to other companies, because suddenly they realized that the costs are like incredibly high, and they can be reduced easily because people don't need so much office space. And the employers are right now competing in finding ways how to attract people to come back. Still in Europe, there are some aspirations of multiple organizations trying to figure out, some fruit days, additional coffee machines, events that will attract people to come back. In my opinion, multiple young, especially generations, appreciate it, they use it, but at the end of the day, they have their own fixed way of working already, which is very much hybrid. And I know just few people who are happy to come back fully to the office, and the rest prefers definitely working in a hybrid. I think that employers should also realize that they cannot expect people really to come back to the old ways, also because the new generation is coming, and the new generation, at least in Europe, what I observe is that they are happy to move anywhere in the world. So, which only confirms what we were saying before. They are not attached to, mortgage, flat, etc. They prefer to rent it and have this flexibility. The same way they are treating the employment. Today I have a great job, but tomorrow I might not have it, or I might find it somewhere else where I will be equally or even happier because of the climate or any other economic conditions of the country. and they are traveling, they will be traveling. So I think that the companies, the most successful companies will need to find the ways not to force people, but rather encourage, invite, and treat with respect. Because this respect of the needs of the employees, listening to the employees is the most important thing that we can offer as employers.
Absolutely, and we've got some questions coming in on Slido, which I think kind of speak to also what you've been saying, Monica and Lynn and Shrila. So I'm just going to go to those and see if we can answer some of those questions. So this is probably worth getting a perspective from each of you. So do you think younger employees new in the workplace have experienced loss differently to more established employees? Lynn, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, so I saw the question. I was thinking about conversations that I've had with our grads in Shell. And I think the loss is this. When you first start your career, it's a very exciting time. You meet new colleagues, you meet other people like you who have just graduated, and you start your new career. And I think that loss in the past few years has been that you join a company and you're sitting at your desk at home somewhere. So I think it's that loss of connection, of friendship, of building your social network, and having fun. I think. I mean, obviously we find different ways of having fun, but I think that almost feels like it is a huge loss in terms of something which most people look forward to. But then I was thinking as well, is it just a loss which the younger generation lose? Is it any different from anyone else? And I think beyond what I've just said, again, I think many of us lose different things. Like for myself, I was perfectly happy to work from home because in my job, I travel a lot, right? So, and I was wondering, like, did I actually, miss, or did I feel a loss of not traveling? Not for the first year, I was absolutely happy. But the second year I did, right? I felt like I had lost something in the way that I interacted, in the way that I was able to be able to work closely with colleagues from across the world. So my response would be, I think some, but I feel like actually the loss is much more around, different regions, but I think humanity. So that would be my response.
Thanks, Lynn. Shrila, do you have a view on this one?
Yeah, probably similar to Lynn. It's a great question, which means that maybe I don't have the right answer. It's a question which makes you think. But I think it's very difficult to, loss is so personal that it is, and our responses to loss are also very unique. But I think the shift in the way of life, because all of us who've been working have known that this comes after this, and there is a certain predictability that we've been working within. We are used to having physical connects with people, and I think maybe our agility to respond to that has not been so great. And but younger people who have also heard from their previous generations about what to expect from a workplace, were expecting certain things, but I think also had the agility to work around and find their own truths. Because I find that a lot of them have probably been more proactive and resilient in engaging with that change. I think a lot of us who have been established feel that you're missing out on this, but I think we all make our own happinesses, and I think that it would be perfect to continue to move towards something which gives us greater connectedness, and valuing that is something that the established employees already know, but I would love the younger generation to also know of.
Thanks. And Monica, maybe I can come to you with the next question. is there any difference in engagement and feeling connected with those working more in the office than those that wish to adopt hybrid working? So I guess you might have a slightly different perspective on that.
I can take it. I would say that there might be a difference in engagement. I can see the difference among different generations still. I can see that baby boomers and even Generation X is much more willing to be more present in the office than the younger generation, which appreciates much more flexibility and this independence that we discussed. And I think that the level of engagement does not necessarily depend on the presence in the office, though. On the other hand, absolutely what Lynn said, it's extremely important how we build relations at work, and building relations remotely is very difficult. This requires huge maturity, very good listening skills, very good communication skills. Otherwise, there is a huge risk of disengagement and disconnection, especially for those that are starting. And we can see huge disproportion and huge attrition among employees who joined us during COVID. And for example, they had trainings only remotely. They were not coming to the office at all. We can see that they are changing the jobs much easier, because after 1 year, they decide that I don't feel any connection with my team, with my boss, that I've seen, twice, for 10 months, for example, and they are living much easier. Those that are building the connections personally, and that's why we, and I'm sure Lynn agrees with me, the personal interaction, and even this through traveling and having this personal touch, looking at someone's face, the mimics, even being physically in a short distance makes a huge difference how we work together in the future. So without meeting personally, without having this occasion, even from time to time, I think there will be disconnectivity, because especially young people are not experienced enough to build these relations remotely and effectively. And there is a risk also in productivity, but if not directly in productivity as such, in terms of processes and services and products that they support, definitely collaboration is heavily impacted. So I think that hybrid is fine, but creating these opportunities to connect and be there and build these direct relations is extremely important.
I'd like to add to that, if I may.
Yes,
Mary?
yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
I had this insight actually from a colleague in Shell, right? So an employee with a disability. And I think when we talk about the way that we communicate, if it's virtual, it's hybrid, or people who like to go into the office, I think it's really important to ask and understand the needs of individuals. So for example, this colleague who had a disability was actually much more comfortable working from home. Yeah, but the line manager was actually concerned that it will impact team building. Yeah, and I think then the lens around the person with a disability who was actually then felt more productive working from home was then lost because of what we just mentioned around interaction, physical aspects. So I think, underlying all of this is just really important for us, again, to be reminded that in whichever situation that works for people, especially now because it's hybrid, that is still very important, from the disability space, to just really make sure that we understand what we need to accommodate from each person.
Absolutely.
Great. And is there anything you'd like to add, Srila, on that one?
Yeah, I think we have to find out a magic bullet because hybrid is here to stay. And that's one thing that we have to figure out, is how to leverage. Listening is definitely something that we need to do, and how to leverage the talent in a way which is also sensitive to people's needs, and also to being part of a larger whole. And I think everybody in the social space is understanding the value of reconnecting with humans, And I think that will spill over. We just have to, I think, facilitate that in a really productive way. And I think we are still thinking on those lines. I don't think we've come up with like a golden rule or a book or a solution to that.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk to you guys about this stuff the rest of the day, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions that we haven't been able to get to. But I just want to thank you all so much for attending today and giving your views, which I'm sure are resonating around the world right now. So, so thank you so much. And I think we're now going into a short break. So if everyone would like to go off and get yourselves a drink, but make sure you come back for our next session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. I hope you had a good break and are suitably refreshed with a beverage of your choice, perhaps even a mince pie, because it is now December. Anyway, I mentioned at the beginning of our session that last week I was lucky enough to be joined in conversation with John McCalla-Lisi, Global Head of ESG at KPMG. You're in for a real treat. He's a fabulous speaker. So here's what he had to say.
ESG, environment, social and governance, is on everyone's lips at the moment. In the autumn, we had a partner dinner where we asked where disability fits into the ESG agenda. And the short answer is everywhere. So we wanted to continue the conversation on a global level today. And that's why I'm delighted to be speaking to John McCalla-Lisi, who is Global Head of ESG at KPMG. And John and I will be talking about the role of leadership in the global ESG agenda, and specifically how to affect transformational change in this ever-changing world, that's an understatement, for disabled people. Lovely to see you, John. Thank you for joining me.
Likewise, always great to see you, Diane, and thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for taking the time in your incredibly busy schedule. I think you're just back from COP27, but we'll come on to that a bit later on. So John, as I mentioned, you are head of global ESG at KPMG. What does it mean to be a leader in this space and at this time?
Well, brilliant question to start off with. It's incredibly difficult. It's challenging. And just to summarize, leaders right now are facing the three C's of challenges, which is climate, cost of living, and also conflict. And what they're seeking to do is they're having to navigate, on one hand, transforming their businesses to ones which are sustainable and low carbon businesses, but also in the short term having to deal with the impact of inflation on their employees, their staff, their customer base. So leaders are often finding that they're having to make some very tough decisions right now. So it's pretty challenging.
Yes, and again, I think that's an understatement. And I think you could still add a fourth C to your list with COVID, which is still kind of lingering on amongst us. So ESG reporting itself is suddenly very much in the spotlight. We, at our global dinner, we were asking, is this the new CSR? What does this actually mean? How can it be used as a force for good? So what are some of the challenges you are seeing, and how do you think ESG reporting can actually be used effectively in business?
Well, in terms of the challenges, and you know, it connects a lot, doesn't it, to your first question. You know, business leaders, I speak a lot to CEOs, and they see that there's a huge push for more reporting, for more transparency, and there's a lot. If you are leading a global company, you've got different reporting standards from right across the world. And you know, right now, I mean, we've recently completed a survey, and we found that of the 250 largest companies in the whole world, some 96% of them are now reporting on ESG and sustainability. So in terms of what that means and the opportunities that we see through this is that businesses can actually go beyond box ticking, go beyond simply complying to these various different reporting requirements. And if they really choose to embrace ESG, which, you know, at its heart through reporting is what they're seeking to have is much more transparency. Much more transparency around what businesses are doing in the E from an environmental perspective, but also from an S perspective, considering societal areas such as diversity, inclusion, human rights. You know, just you know, in their businesses, in terms of the countries in which they operate, which includes countries right across the globe and throughout their supply chain. So what we see is that when businesses are, you know, happy to step forwards and embrace this reporting and go beyond purely compliance, you know, to really thinking about what strategically, what the strategic benefits they have to having more transparency, more sustainable workforce and more sustainable practices. They see that it's driving a different conversation, a conversation that's going from the boardroom right down and throughout the organization. And it's driving transformational change to what I believe is the goal that we all want to get to, which is from compliance through strategic change to purpose-led and sustainable businesses.
I love that. I love the beyond compliance piece. And of course, unfortunately, there are countries in the world where disability is very much a human rights issue, but it's also very much a talent issue and a consumer issue. And one of the things that has struck me since I've been at BDF, which is almost 6 years, is just how much good practice and genuine commitment to getting it right there is in a lot of large global private sector businesses, which is really, really encouraging to see. But I think it can, ESG, to be slightly provocative, it can sound boring. And it's bringing it to life, isn't it? That narrative. And I remember when we were chatting before, John, you were saying about how to tell that story in a compelling way. So what are some of the things are you seeing, and do you have advice around that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because it can just seem like this big construct, and which is really unclear as to what it absolutely, you know, means. And I think, you know, with all storytelling, it's important to put your heart right in the centre of it, to make it really personal in terms of, you know, telling the story. So let's talk about, you know, the E, you know, as it were. So we're all struggling right now with the energy crisis that we see. And we know that the energy crisis would not be as deep, it would not be as prevalent right now if only us as leaders took decisions in the past to, you know, to invest in energy efficiency so as to reduce the demand that we have right now, or to invest in the renewables so as to increase the security of supply. So when you talk about that in a very simple way, and you talk about it in terms of what it means for us as individuals. So for myself, as you can see, I'm in my home office right now. I'm in the loft. I spend a lot of time myself, you know, layering my insulation. So I talk about that in a very, very personal way. And then considering the S is so critically important, you know, talking about inclusion, diversity and equity, talking about this in a way which opens up and reveals some of yourself as a leader. So I'm from a Jamaican heritage. I often share about, you know, my parents coming to the UK in the 60s from Jamaica. It was very cold there. It was a cold time, but often, you know, it was cold in terms of, you know, being quite hostile to them, and what that meant for them in terms of how they lived, you know, at that time through the 60s, right to modern day right now. I talk about, you know, my own a struggle with disability, either unseen disability. People are often quite shocked about this because they say, what is it? And I like to leave it a little bit out there so that they ask the questions, and then you're engaging, and then you're talking. And when you're talking about something in a way which is really relatable and really personal, and that's when you can connect with people on a completely different level.
Totally. Those personal stories are so powerful. And as you're saying about having a disability that's not immediately visible, well, that's true of 90%, over 90% of disabilities, but so many people still don't realize that. I think what you're just saying about investing as well and acting in advance is really important. I'm just thinking of that expression, I'm going to get it wrong, but the best time to plant an oak tree is 100 years ago, but the second best time is now.
Yes.
So making sure that we don't just say, oh, it's all too late and we're too reliant on carbon, or we're too reliant on whatever. We can still all individually and collectively make a change.
Absolutely. The time is always right to do the right thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we also talk quite a lot around how E and S, and I'm guessing G, are not separate. So one of the messages that we've tried to get across, we had a report earlier this year about built environment, which is if you are thinking about your carbon footprint and your built environment from an environmental point of view, also think about accessibility at the same time. Take that opportunity to do both rather than making it an either or, because disabled people are equally, in some cases, more affected by climate change. So we do this. So on to climate.
Yes.
You've just returned from COP27 in Egypt. Yes. So what have you been saying to senior leaders about ESG and specifically about disability?
Yeah, no, that's great. So if I set context a little bit first, so I was incredibly fortunate in going to COP26 and have, as you said, just returned from COP27. Now, COP26 for me was the COP of commitment. So we saw going into Glasgow, there was approximately 30% of global GDP covered by net zero or net zero related goals, so 30%. And it was at the time coming out of COVID, whereby, we weren't quite sure, well, was it going to happen? Would it be remote? Will leaders turn up? And it had this really low number of 30%. Now, coming out of Glasgow, that 30% went right up to 90% of global GDP commitments. So that's fantastic. So COP26 was really seen as the COP of commitment. Now, COP27 was really framed as, taking that commitment and driving action, because it's very, very clear we are not, I repeat, we are not on track for 1.5 degrees. And what we need to do is to take those words, take those distant off targets and drive them into action right now. But what's so important, and this is what I want to touch on now as regards to disability, for COP27, not only do we need to focus on action, but we need to make sure that it is just, it is fair, and it is equitable. And one of the big issues that we've seen through all of the COPs, all of them, you can go back to the very start, is there been a lack of diversity in terms of the voices around the table who are contributing to the debate, who are contributing to the action plans. Now, for COP27, we've seen more progress in this space. And the reason why I say that is that there was a notable increase in the numbers of people who are, persons with disabilities who are actually attending COP27, which is great. We saw a noticeable increase in the numbers of discussions and debates. It's really frantic when you're on the ground there, Diane. There's lots of negotiation rooms. Yeah, so it's a lot to take in. So there was an increase there also. And one of the things I would say is that there was also actionable, so specific language on disability, which was adopted by this COP, which is really encouraging. This is in the action on climate empowerment, which would see the inclusion of more communication, more information, more education with the public and public participation through people with disabilities. So what I would say is, as we move from commitment to action, I've seen some green shoots of hope in terms of some more dialogue, but it's not enough. And what we need to do is we need to hold leaders to account in ensuring that that commitment grows as we move forwards.
I really like that there's that focus on specific language around disability and making sure that people with disabilities are equally engaged and can play their part in solving this, because it's going to have to be absolutely everyone that does it. And as you were talking, I was about the lack of diversity of people in the room around the table. I was thinking of the importance of inclusive design, and a couple of important but kind of micro examples. I'm thinking of the banning of plastic straws, for example, for very, very good reasons, but some people with disabilities rely on them to eat and drink. And possibly more dramatically, not sure, electric vehicles that don't make a noise, great for not having sound pollution, not so great if you have a visual impairment and can't actually hear them coming. So there's been some really interesting and very important learning around making sure that we get everybody's lived experience in the room when we're making these big and actually micro decisions as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And what we'll see is this immersion, or this continuous, this whole construct called just transition, ensuring that the transition is just for all, and it will simply not happen unless we have those voices around the table. Interestingly enough, I was involved in COP in a discussion and a panel, and in this debate we touched on exactly the plastic straws piece and saying, well, we cannot allow things like this to happen. So we need to challenge ourselves when we start a meeting. When everybody goes around the table, when we introduce themselves, even before starting a meeting, we should be considering who's invited, you know, what is the debate, do we have proper representation, and if not, let's make sure we make changes appropriately. So, but we need to keep an eye on this. You know, as I said, there are green shoots, but we're not there yet. We need to keep pushing forwards.
Totally. I like a just transition. And of course, we will only know we're making progress if we manage to measure. And this is probably not a sweeping generalisation to say that senior leaders are usually very interested in numbers and collecting data. So from your point of view, why is that important? And also, how do leaders address pushback from people with disabilities who say, why should we tell you, and what are you going to do with that information?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, and look, in summary, Diane, how I would position this is that we know that in the world of business, what gets measured gets managed. And, you know, unless we're able to measure, we cannot show progress. And actually, what it means from a leadership perspective is leaders are not being held accountable. We need transparency. With transparency, as I mentioned, becomes trust, but also with that comes accountability. And when we have these discussions and when we have the pushback, I really believe that it's incredibly important for leaders to engage directly with members of the disability community and directly with them in hearing their concerns. One of the things I talk about a lot, it really drives me personally, is there's power in proximity. And taking that time to be close, taking that time to hear their concerns, and also to share, you know, what it is that we're trying to achieve, and actually say, well, look, this is what we're trying to do, but we want your help on this. We need your help. We need to measure this because, quite frankly, in business, we're not doing very well. It's not good enough. The rate to which we have capitalized on the huge array of talent that we have available to us is quite frankly quite disappointing. We've recruited, we've promoted from a very, very small and narrow window of talent, and this is where we have to change, and we have to change quickly. So it's having that discussion, it's having that debate, it's saying to people, please, you know, hold me accountable on this. This is what I want you to do, and I want you to talk to me. And if we're not progressing to the pace that we should be, you should be asking me why, and we should be moving forward together to make change happen faster. So it's that dialogue that is incredibly important.
That transparency and authenticity that I know that you talk so eloquently about. I love power in proximity. In some respects, I'm guessing it's got easier doing things remotely because you can actually connect directly with people, although of course it is through a screen. So I know, John, that we're nearly out of time. I could talk to you for hours. You're so eloquent on this. So I guess any kind of final thoughts that you would like to share to global leaders listening to this about what they can do to be a transformational leader in this space?
Well, just continuing on from that power in proximity, I believe really strongly, Diane, that we need to focus on driving, on role modeling a form of ethical leadership, which has a fundamental belief in the dignity and the rights of others at its heart. And, through that, and if we just think and reflect for a second as leaders, if we really had that at our heart in every dialogue, in every communication that we ever shared, what that would mean in shaping our engagement with our staff and with our customers and our suppliers. I also believe, in addition to the ethical leadership, that we need to be humble. As leaders, humility is so important. We're all on a journey, and we're all learning. We touched on the 3 C's or the 4th C that you mentioned, Diane, before with COVID, that we're in very, very challenging times. And as leaders, we need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to be prepared to actually say, well, you know what, we've made a mistake. We will do things differently. And the third and final thing for me is about being courageous as leaders. It's about being prepared, if necessary, to stand alone in doing what's right over the long term. So for us at KPMG, and I know we've talked about this before, Diane, we've been very, very transparent in setting targets for representation. So we've got a target of 15%, and we challenged ourselves in this, and we decided we're going to be courageous. That target shouldn't just be across the whole of the organization, but specifically in senior leadership. So this means that, when we look at the organization, when we look at representation of persons with disabilities, we're looking at the partners, the directors, and the senior leaders in our organization, and we're ensuring that we are being bold, being courageous in doing all that we can to drive, proper diversity and proper inclusion across our firm. So what I would say is ethical leadership with humility, but with courage at its heart, is incredibly important.
Thank you, John. I think you've beautifully just illustrated the importance of role modelling. And if ever there was a short masterclass on ethical, inclusive and humble leadership, I think you've just given it. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute honour to talk with you. And I sincerely hope this won't be the last of our conversations in this, because I would love to pick your brain some more around the measurement and how we really drive this agenda forward inclusively and have, as you say, a just transition. So huge thanks to John McCalla-Lisi for joining me, and back to our global conference.
Well, thank you, virtual Diane. Great to hear John McCalla-Lisi's thoughts there, particularly on ESG and on leadership. Now, for the next session, we are frequently approached at Business Disability Forum around the topic of neurodiversity, how to support employees, how to educate colleagues, particularly what language to use. With that in mind, I am glad to be joined by Aidan Healy, Chair of Lexic, who are leaders in the field of neurodiversity, who's going to tell us all about why global business needs neurodiverse talent. Aidan's going to be giving us a short presentation, but I warn you now, I will be popping back on screen in 15 minutes to ask Aidan your questions. So please do post all of your comments and questions in Slido. But for now, Aidan, the virtual floor is yours, and I'll see you again in 15.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you so much for the invitation to the conference today. As Daniel said, my name is Aidan. I'm chair of an organization called Lexic. We are an organization that specializes in neurodiversity in the workplace and in higher education. I am a white male. I have blonde hair. I have blue eyes. I'm wearing a bluey, wintry pullover type top because it's quite a cold day in the UK today. And yeah, I guess I wanted to take 15 minutes to talk a little bit about this subject, neurodiversity, because I think neurodiversity is a word that most of us haven't grown up with and is only really starting to become more mainstream in organizational discussions over the last few years. Reflecting on the BDF's global language guide, there's definitely a global language guide we could do here for neurodiversity and words like neurodivergent. But a short summary is that neurodiversity, it really describes the idea that we experience and interact with the world in many different ways. And there's no one right way of thinking and learning and behaving. And many of these differences are just that. They are differences and not deficits. And although you may not know the word neurodiversity, I think you're probably familiar with some of the conditions or differences that people refer to themselves when they use the term neurodiverse or neurodivergent. Differences like dyslexia or ADHD or autism. And I suppose, you know, it's interesting to also think about when we talk about neurodiversity, people like myself often put up these wide-ranging percentage differences. And I think it's very important to say that your access to the label of being neurodivergent can often be a challenge because your access to that label often comes from a clinical or medical diagnosis. And depending on what society or culture you're joining me from, the access to those diagnostic services may be limited. The access to those services may come with a lot of stigma, so many people don't reach out to them. Or, you know, what we consider the norm in one culture can often be very different in another culture. So, for example, one of the things that's often associated with autism or being autistic is maybe sometimes challenges making eye contact. And that might be considered disrespectful or rude in one culture, but actually in a different culture, it can be interpreted as very respectful and may not raise a red flag. And so I think it's important to say that, you know, we're talking about a lot of differences here, but a very significant portion of the population. And one thing I will absolutely observe is that pretty much 100% of organizations I see now are saying they're committed to diversity and inclusion. But what I'm seeing is a very small percentage of organizations really are leaving neurodiversity out of the business ecosystem and the business agenda. And I think if we're talking about diversity and inclusion and talent management and getting the best out of our people, we've got to consider that 15 to 20% of the population who think differently and who see the world in a different way. And I guess what I wanted to try and give you, you know, in the next 10 minutes is challenges I hear very frequently, which is, you know, we're not sure where to get started. this topic feels complicated. I'm not sure what best practice we can point to. And that often results in us doing very safe kind of practices like running a one-off awareness day, or it falls into this label of kind of another HR or another D&I initiative. Unfortunately, the good people at the BDF have a lot of other speakers today, so they've given me 15 minutes to do this. So I'm not going to solve all of your problems, but there are three things we see again and again, I suppose, in our role in Lexic when it comes to thinking about neurodiversity and how you might go about either starting or enhancing your own global neurodiversity strategy. And the first thing I really want you to think about is understanding the business opportunity and how you frame the neurodiversity conversation. Because so often, I think one of the reasons the conversation is not on the agenda, or maybe near the bottom of the agenda, is how we go about framing the conversation. And I'll give you a very practical, real world example here. This is a big global recruitment company. They very much meant well. They put together a neurodiversity toolkit for managers. And what you're seeing here on screen is what they said to expect if you're a line manager managing someone with ADHD. And let me just read out a few examples here of what they've said. They say if you expect to manage someone with ADHD, they can be easily distractive and flit from task to task. They say they have difficulty with short-term memory. They say they lack attention to detail. They say they tend to be accident prone. They say they display challenges with social timing and may be less motivated. And unsurprisingly, this is the classic charity model, medical model approach that we kind of talk about when we come to disability. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of us have grown up with these labels, be it dyslexia or dyspraxia or autism or ADHD. When we hear these words, we immediately think of the negative. We immediately think of what the person may find challenging. And if we expect organizations to spend their time and money and extremely busy senior people already drowning under 100 other things to do, we've got to think about how we add neurodiversity to that list. And similarly, if your organization presented neurodiversity to you in this way, would you be willing to put your hand up? Would you be willing to seek support? Or if you're already feeling othered in this organization, maybe let's say due to your gender or your ethnicity, would you also want to be identified as being neurodiverse as well? So I think it's very important when we think about neurodiversity, we move away from this deficit disorder model, much more towards kind of thinking about the context of the environment rather than the individual themselves. And when we work with neurodivergent talent, we really do see this, which is there is a world of difference in a person's performance depending on what environment they're in or what adjustments or accommodations they're offered within the existing environment. So someone who is impatient in one environment can be a go-getter and an entrepreneur in another. Someone who's seen as impulsive in one environment can be a fast decision maker, a fast mover in another environment. And I think that's very important. We think about the context as opposed to thinking about just the individual and their differences. I think the other main thing to think about, or another thing to think about in terms of neurodiversity, is also looking at the legal framework. I'm showing you here an example of the UK Equality Act, and of course, legal definitions vary around the world. But in many environments, neurological differences are categorized as protected characteristics. So you as an organization, and especially your line managers, can't just discount them or bury your heads in the sand. We saw a big case come out recently in the media. Someone was awarded £50,000 by a UK tribunal because the individual was performance managed, a dyslexic individual, for making mistakes in their emails. And we see this a lot in our work, which is where organizations will label someone with ADHD as lazy or high maintenance. They'll label someone who is autistic as not being a team player. And very quickly, this can run your organization into difficulties when it comes to protected characteristics, depending on the disability or equality laws within your region. Third thing to think about, I suppose, is, as I said, as I touched on earlier, is to look at this social model and social argument, which is if I said to your organization, imagine you're building a new building in 22, 23, but there's no lifts, there's no ramps, there's no disabled parking spaces, there's no disabled bathrooms. You would probably say, okay, that sounds quite ridiculous. But what if I said to you, actually, there's a really important piece of information critical to a person's job, critical to their ability to do the job, but it's locked away in a 42-page triple column PDF, Arial size 8. It's security protected, so it doesn't work on any assistive technology. You can't copy it into, say, a product like Word. That's really not a challenge unique to dyslexia. That's very much a challenge for me based around poor organizational design. And finally, I think one big thing to think about as well, and I think we really miss this a lot, is there's also a value-based model here, or a value-based argument. The report on the left is a report called The Value of Dyslexia by Ernst & Young, which is actually really talking about, because a person's brain is wired differently, they may have unique challenges, but that different wiring can also give them unique strengths. And we're really seeing across the corporate sector now, many organizations starting to recruit specifically for neurodivergent talent or reach out to neurodivergent talent, because that 15% of the population are a talent attraction opportunity, a retention opportunity, a brand opportunity. Those 15% of people worldwide are a customer opportunity with a lot of money to spend in your business if you take the time to appeal to them and support them to be their best selves at work or as your customers. So that's point number one, the point I really wanted to spend the most time on, which I think is understanding the business opportunity, or the lack of understanding, is often why I think we miss having the neurodiversity conversation on the business agenda. The second thing I really want to talk to you about is to focus on this idea of barriers rather than feeling like you have to be an expert in every condition. One of the big things we hear from employers is, this is complicated, this feels medicalized, we don't know what to do, we're terrified of saying the wrong thing. And to think about this, I'd like you to I'm going to give you a few examples as to how we might reframe this. So first of all, let's think about information. Never, I think, in the history of humanity have we produced more words in more places with more velocity. And the vast majority of business leaders I speak to feel exhausted by this phenomenon. They feel their inboxes are jammed, their workplaces are paralyzed, their minds are clogged, and most of us are not great multitaskers. With lots of studies showing we really struggle to refocus our attention if we're interrupted. And frankly, the result of this in our organizations is billions of wasted words. If we're honest with ourselves, how many of your work emails do we really digest in full? How many reports do people spend time in our companies putting together that aren't read? And whether you're in a Fortune 500 or a new startup, how you adapt to people consume content, not how you wish they did or how they did once upon a time, is such an important part of your business. And you can learn this very quickly by listening to your dyslexic colleagues. You can learn this very quickly by adapting to technology. You can learn this by saying, you know what, this doesn't have to be a long email. It can be a voice memo. It can be a mind map. It can be something else. And similarly, I think, historically, one of the big adjustments and accommodation requests we had for people with neurodifferences was flexible hours or the ability to work from home. This often came because of sensory sensitivity. And for years, we were told these accommodations or adjustments could only be provided to a limited few once they had proved the severity of their challenges or of these differences. And again, I think this is not just a neurodiversity conversation. If we implement some of these changes, it actually benefits everybody. And I think, you know, there's a lot of us who feel it's going to be a real tragedy if we go back to, if we remove, let's say, remote working and flexible hours and diverse ways of engagement as we move beyond, let's say, the immediacy and urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's point number 2. The final point I just want to talk to you about, I suppose, is leadership and accountability. And because this work is so personal, its supporters and advocates are often motivated by emotions, and emotions are very critical to raising awareness, to inviting others into the conversation. But when it actually comes to implementing organizational change, being fired up and being emotional isn't enough. And I think when we talk about D&I, we've got to work through this like we would work it through any other professional organizational challenge, which is through research, through collaboration, through design, through continuous learning, through feedback, through accountability. And I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of our leaders are living in a world where budgets are tightening, shareholder prices is down, and where they have also spent big on diversity and inclusion budgets over the last couple of years, and they're wondering what has been the value to that, or what are we getting from it? So I think leadership is very important, but also a clear way of actually tracking and measuring success when you go about doing that. So let me finish there, and we will do some questions and answers. As I said, 3 main things to think about, which is number 1, understand the business opportunity of neurodiversity. Number 2, really think about this as a barriers conversation, because we can't expect people globally to show up with diagnostics and neat labels and present themselves in a way that we can always understand what their needs and challenges are. And number 3 is, I really think as leaders, we have to approach this not simply as it's the right thing to do or in an emotional way. We've actually got to apply the kind of business rigor that we do to any other initiative in the organization. If you want to learn more about us and in Lexic, our full framework is called Neurodiversity Smart. It's a methodology for making your organization more neuro-inclusive. And you're welcome to reach out to me afterwards or reach out to the team if there's anything more we can do to help. So thank you very much for listening. And Daniel, I'm looking forward to taking some questions from the audience or from the chat.
Thanks, Aidan. Always great to hear from you. And I should point out, I've been told that there may be some issues with Slido at the moment. It's the Slido technology. But some questions have been coming in nonetheless. So we will continue until we are hoiked off of the virtual stage by someone else. So first of all, in some organizations, neurodiversity networks are separating from pan-disability networks as members don't identify as being disabled. So just wonder, what are your thoughts on this pattern regarding those networks?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's always a tension within employee networks or within organizational strategies as grouping people together for a larger collective versus breaking people down into smaller subgroups. The reality is many people who identify as neurodivergent don't use the word disabled to describe themselves and their differences. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the word disability or the word disabled. That's just not how they describe themselves. So if you put those groups together, there is a risk that when you say, look, this is a call out to all disabled employees, you will not appeal to your neurodivergent community. The counter argument to that, of course, is that you start to divide people up into groups. And again, even within neurodiversity networks, 10 people with ADHD may have a very different way of wanting to run a network meeting than 10 people who are autistic. So I think there's always a tension between the two. I know some organizations are actually moving away from, let's say, calling their networks disability networks or pan-disability networks. They're calling them things like Thrive and Diversibility and Enable and so on. And that's one idea. So I can't say I'll give you a definitive answer on it. I would say there's pros and cons to both depending on the size of your organization. And a good way to always go about this is consulting with your community to see what they need. Brilliant. Thank you for that. And had a question in around it's a promotion, I suppose, again, that part of the employee life cycle. So neurodiverse people often have strengths and challenges that make following the standard promotion route very difficult. Is there any work going on that you know of to help get around this? Yeah, I think, you know, one of the interesting things we've been working on a lot in Lexic at the moment is, you know, when we talk about disability or neurodiversity, a lot of organizations will commission a workplace assessment and they will get a snapshot of where that employee is on their journey, and they'll recommend a series of accommodations. What we've actually started to do, particularly if you talk about these kind of talent programs or high performing leadership programs or future leadership programs, is not to actually assess for where the individual is today, but also assess to where that individual wants to be in the future. So, for example, someone with dyslexia, let's say they're working on a supermarket, moving from the shop floor to management is going to be a very different role change for them. They're going to have a lot more emails, a lot more paperwork, a lot more things to review. But what we see a lot of organizations do is they wait until the promotion has happened, and then the individual hits a challenge and then they start again. So I think that's certainly one thing to consider, is actually sitting down with individuals and not looking at where they are today, but where they want to go to, and look at what adjustments or training or support can be put in place for that future. That's where a lot of neurodivergent people, I think, come across challenges in their employee life cycle or their career journey. Yeah, absolutely. And especially because we get a lot of people asking around, you know, how do we attract neurodiverse talent as well? About making those sorts of changes is always going to make you a more attractive employer anyway. So again, concentrating on the future and not just the now sounds like a good way to go. Now, I think you touched on this a little already. I think it may come back to those barriers, but with the level of understanding awareness around neurodiversity being different from region to region, how would you advise an organization that wants to develop and implement a global neurodiverse strategy in navigating that difference? Yeah, and I suppose just to re-echo this point, you know, neurodiversity or that language or terminology is going to be much more prevalent in some cultures than in others. For example, there are other countries worldwide where the prevalence of autism is 1% of that as it is in the UK. Now, does that mean there are 100 times more autistic people in the UK than elsewhere in the world? Or do the people in the UK have access to an infrastructure, be that medical diagnosis, be that social support, be that an education system, be that a lack of stigma towards autistic people over the last 30 years that is allowing more people to be identified? Again, and I think you have to acknowledge this, there are many people in your organization who may meet the diagnostic criteria of being neurodivergent, but they don't have that label to understand themselves. They don't have that, or they won't identify that label when they speak to you. And again, I think this is really where we go back to understanding what the barriers of participation are for people who think differently. So if we're thinking about our organization and the way we work, how do we include people who think differently from the norm? How do we, include people who may engage in meetings or socially interact and communicate or read and write and process information differently? And again, I think one of the big pandemic conversations we had about this was working from home. Working from home used to be a very specific accommodation that Lexic and other organizations have spent absolutely years being told, no, it's not possible. No, it won't happen. I don't care if they have high sensory sensitivity. Get them on the underground, get them in here, send them an hour a day. And so it took a pandemic for us to kind of go, actually, maybe there's a different way of working. And I really hope it doesn't take another global healthcare catastrophe or challenge to implement some of these adjustments and accommodations long term.
Exactly. Again, planning for the future rather than just reacting to what's going on in front of us at the time.
100%.
I think we've got time for just one more question, Aidan. And this
Sure.
one comes in. What top tips could you give me as a neurodivergent individual to support my line manager to work with me more effectively?
Yeah, so I think, again, when working with line managers, it's important not just to, let's say, share your difference, but also share how that impacts you. So what I hear and what we hear in Lexic a lot from line managers is someone may come into their office and say, look, I'd like to share with you that I have ADHD, but the line manager maybe doesn't know what that means in the context of the day-to-day work environment. So I think when you're having a line manager conversation, it's very helpful to say, and this is how this impacts me at work, or this is what benefits me. Now, if you don't know that, or maybe if you're recently diagnosed, you can speak to the line manager or HR about maybe getting a workplace assessment or other types of support. We also in Lexic, and I know many other organizations will also offer line manager coaching or co-coaching as well to help your line manager or help line managers work with you in a different way. And again, what I hear a lot from line managers is the barriers conversation. We all have lots and lots of labels in our lives. And I really think we're, I think good workplaces talk about, look, tell me who you are and how you show up and what I need to know about you, because we all have so many labels. There are so many labels in disability. There are so many labels in neurodiversity that we're going to spend a very long time if we expect line managers to know about all of the labels. Mm-hmm. But the line managers I speak to are very engaged in how do I help get the best out of you and how do I help you work your best in our team.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Aidan. I knew that we'd end up going to the wire on this one, but it's always a pleasure talking to you. As Aidan said, please do check out Lexic website to find out a little bit more about their framework, different services they offer. And of course, members of Business Disability Forum have also got access to our People Managers Toolkit and Neurodiversity Toolkit as well. Yes. So there are resources around to be able to help. But yeah, thanks very much, Aidan. It was great speaking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Aidan. And now I believe we're going to be introducing Diane back to take us through to the next session.
Thanks very much, Dan, and a big thank you to Aidan for, as always, a fabulous presentation. And sorry we didn't give you longer, Aidan. We'll have to give you longer next time. So now it's time for our panel. How are you feeling? Checking in on the mental wellness of your global workforce. And we pre-recorded this session last week to accommodate busy diaries. So we will go to that recording in a moment where virtual Diane will be chairing. But before we do, I wanted to just remind you that we have lots of fact sheets, case studies, videos, and other resources, lots and lots of them in our mental health toolkit, which can help you shape and deliver your organisation's mental health strategy and also provide you and your teams with practical support. And I particularly wanted to mention that if you are affected by what we'll be discussing today, and indeed what was discussed in the language of loss panel a little earlier. Anyway, enough from me. Let's go to the pre-record. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our panel, How Are You Feeling? Checking in on the mental wellness of your global workforce. Now, there was a great deal of interest in collecting information and stats about how many people with disabilities work for an employer. But is it time to lose the labels? Some disabled employees are beginning to push back on this. Why do employers want to know? And more importantly, what are employers going to do with the information when they've got it? When it comes to mental well-being, in some countries, managers and employees are encouraged to have open conversations and to bring their whole selves to work. But that isn't true everywhere. So how do employers support employees where there might be stigma or reluctance to talk about having a disability, or where a mental health condition isn't considered to be a disability? To discuss all this and more, I'm delighted to welcome our panellists. Loic Andre, Commercial Director of Asia and founder of OJ Ability at Oliver James, and Loic is joining us from Hong Kong. Angela Matthews, Head of Policy and Research at Business Disability Forum here in the UK. Kathy Miner, Diversity and Inclusion Division, Strategy and Measures Group from Saudi Aramco, and Kathy is based in Saudi Arabia. And Laura Frost, who is the Regional Benefits and Wellbeing Lead for HSBC in the UAE. So a very warm welcome to you all. So, Angela, if I might start with you to kick us off. In the UK, we often talk about disability and mental well-being. Is that the same everywhere in the world, or is disability very separate to mental well-being in some places?
Thank you. So in the UK, we are very data-driven. The narrative about disability and how mental well-being has come into that is very much driven by the government's agenda of measuring disability and mental health and well-being in employment. It actually, the sort of conflation is quite controversial. So there are debates in the UK about, is disability, should it be considered alongside mental health? And actually mental health and having a mental health condition is entirely different to looking after our mental well-being. We actually get it from the government's disability confidence scheme. It was actually a huge sort of, quite a big deal in the UK when disability and mental wellbeing were seen together for the first time in what is called the voluntary reporting framework in the UK, which is a framework for how we might measure these things in our workforce. But actually in the UK at the moment, also at that same policy level, we are discussing, should we collect data? Should employers be made to collect data on disability and wellbeing and mental health? And if so, how should we do that? And I think it comes down to wherever we are in the world, whether it's the UK or in another country, are we a data-driven organisation or are we a people-driven organisation? And I think as a researcher in researching in policy, my response should be those two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. But actually our current research on diversity workforce reporting shows that actually the experience of employees being data-driven and being people-driven are two very entirely separate things. So I think the UK has a unique approach to this at the moment, but it doesn't mean we've got it perfect.
Thank you, Ange. I can definitely resonate with that and the conflation of mental well-being and mental health conditions, which is something that we might come back to. If I can come to Kathy now. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you.
Great to see you. So Kathy, you're an American woman working in Saudi Arabia. Have you noticed any significant differences when talking about disability and mental well-being or mental health in Saudi Arabia compared to the USA?
You know, I definitely have. And it's interesting going off Ange's comments, because when I think about this question, my first thought was data. is, in the US, we have a lot of information on the incidence and impact of mental health and mental disabilities, both inside and outside the workplace in the US. And so we know regional and national differences based on different disability statuses and age and gender, et cetera. And so I think it's become kind of mainstream to talk about and somewhat destigmatized because there's so much data, and organizations too, right, collect data often as part of engagement surveys on mental health. So employees are used to that as well. Less is known in Saudi Arabia about the incident and impact of mental health disorders and just mental health in general. So it's a little bit more taboo. This is changing though. So we're seeing more attention given to the subject. And there's actually, I was really excited about this. There's a national survey that's just come out that was done in coordination with WHO and their mental health survey initiative. And so now we have this great survey of data of Saudis and mental health. So we're beginning to see the change. And one kind of interesting thing about this too is that the youth are the ones to really seem to sort of be pushing this change as well. They are much more aware than older populations of mental health issues and struggles, and so there's just more awareness, and they're really kind of pressing for changes, I think, at the societal level and in the workplace.
I think you're absolutely right about the younger generation, and I do wonder. I mean, it was happening pre-pandemic, but I do wonder if COVID has actually had a positive impact in accelerating some of those conversations. And I think hearing you talk, I'm reflecting on starting work in the disability space almost exactly 20 years ago, and then the received wisdom was just don't talk about mental health because it is just a complete no-no. So the fact even in the UK we are where we are now, I think is cause for celebration. And if there are green shoots in other countries where it's traditionally more difficult, then that's really good to hear too. So coming to you, Laura, same question, but this time as a British woman in the Middle East. You're joining us from the UAE. So how do things look where you are?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. So when I first moved to Dubai in the UAE, which was nearly 9 years ago now, I must say I saw a notable difference when it came to talking about mental health. It definitely was very much of a taboo topic and something not openly talked about. Generally speaking, it was kept quite private. But also, I do keep in mind that while the UAE has made tremendous developments and tremendous growth, it is still a fairly new country. So actually, it's celebrating its 51st National Day on the 1st of December. So the infrastructure to support mental health is not as well established as the more mature markets such as the UK. Accessing health services privately through the medical insurance in the UAE is really the norm. However, up until April last year, mental health support typically wasn't available on a direct billing basis under the medical insurance. It was only on a pay and claim back basis. But actually it's costly and not everybody's in the position to lay out that cost up front. So basically, if you had the flu or you broke your arm, you'd be covered on a direct billing basis, but if you needed mental health support, you wouldn't be. But please sort of share that HSBC partnered with our medical insurance provider, and we've managed to drive some change. And actually now there is a robust network of hospitals offering mental health support on a direct billing basis. We also saw last year that the Dubai Healthcare Authority issued guidance to insurance companies, basically recommending that they should offer mental health coverage. And I think to your point, Diane, I think the pandemic has actually helped encourage more conversations on mental well-being. And I've definitely seen more businesses prioritising it in the UAE. More and more companies are ensuring that they've got resources in place to support employees. And actually, there's been real positive developments where more and more people are feeling comfortable to talk about their mental health.
That's good to hear. And gosh, I mean, we talk about a hierarchy of disability and how unhelpful that is, but that's a real tangible example of where somebody is substantially disadvantaged because their condition, which could be equally disabling, is not considered of merit to be funded. So that's really quite That's really quite thought-provoking. And it's not that long ago, and it probably still happens, that even in the UK, people will take time off for depression or similar and say actually they've got flu or a cold. So yes, there's still a way to go. So a follow-up question for you both, Cathy and Laura. In the UK, and probably in other Western countries too, businesses tell us that they find disability is the facet of diversity, equity and inclusion that they find the most difficult. It's often the one that is the least mature, that feels like the poor relation, and often gets parked into the kind of too difficult, too sensitive box. But I'm just listening to you both speak. I'm wondering if perhaps in other cultures, like the Middle East, it's actually easier than some aspects, other aspects of diversity. Cathy, can I come to you on that first?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is easier than some other aspects of diversity. Age is pretty easy. I would say age and disability are probably the easiest in the Middle East. I think gender, while certainly changing, ideas around gender, there's still pretty traditional attitudes, gender roles, stereotypes that that are pretty common. So that can be difficult and sensitive to talk about. And then certainly there's other aspects of diversity that are completely absent from conversations for legality or cultural or other issues. So they're just absolutely not talked about. But my experience has been that employees really embrace and want to be advocates of disability inclusion. They're really excited about it. They want to be a part of it. And so I think it is a little easier.
Well, that's kind of good to know, and a bit of a silver lining on a subject that, of course, is extremely topical at the moment.
Yes.
And one of the things that I often say, and we often say, is that disability is part of the human condition, and it's the one aspect of diversity that any of us can join at any point in our lives. So it should be the one that people are advocating for and getting behind and supporting and understanding. So I will definitely take the positives from that. That's good to hear. And Laura, does that resonate with you?
It does, yes. And I think actually the UAE is actually quite unique because expats make up the vast majority of the population. So it is very multicultural. But while the UAE, particularly Dubai, is often deemed actually as more progressive than some of the other countries across the region. And we've seen many recent positive changes in the law. And the country is very open and evolving and adapting to best practices from other markets. But the reality is traditional, cultural, Middle East sensitivities, they do still exist, as has been highlighted in the media recently because of the World Cup being in Qatar. However, sort of back to the question, this does help to bring disability at the forefront of the agenda, and supporting people with disability is actually a key focus of the UAE government, which is just amazing to see. So I'll just give some examples around there. So the UAE Disability Act passed in 2006 to protect the rights of people with disability. However, in 2017, under the National Policy for Empowering People with Special Needs and Disabilities, they're now referred to as the people of determination to recognise their achievements in different fields. Now, I do appreciate that this term is very sort of controversial, and some countries in favour and others not, but in the UAE, it is intended with all respect. And essentially, the UAE strategy today and the vision for 2030 for people with disability is to reaffirm the commitment to inclusion and equality. We've seen some great examples where last year, the Expo 2020 was actually hosted in Dubai, and multiple special arrangements were made to accommodate people of determination. Also in November this year, HSBC were the proud sponsor of the Accessibilities Expo, which was again held in Dubai. This expo, again, strongly supported by the government bodies, and is a platform that reflects the aspirations and expectations of over 50 million people with disabilities who reside in the Middle East. this expo provided opportunities to explore the best and latest innovations and technologies from around the world that enhance the lives of people with determination. So this has really sort of helped to drive the agenda and empower organisations. And just to give an example of something at HSBC that we think is really adding value, we in the UAE have an employee resource group called Ability. And basically, their role is to support and advocate for colleagues with both visible and non-visible disabilities or differences. And in a nutshell, what they basically do is they build allies and sponsorship with our senior leadership team to advocate the ability goals. They support internal stakeholders and teams to produce policies that attract, retain, and develop staff. They raise awareness and provide education to reduce stigma, and they also promote the need for market-leading adjustments to enable all staff to be at their best. And essentially, they're lobbying for sustainable change. So lots of positive work going on in the UAE in this space.
That sounds like a very dynamic and effective employee resource group, and of course, championing an effective adjustments process or accommodations in other parts of the world is music to my ears. I did want to pick up on the terminology point, because earlier today we've launched our new global language guide, which HSBC has very kindly supported, and language is something that people want to get right and have often strong and different opinions on. So people of determination, Kathy, you're also in the Middle East. Do you have thoughts on that one?
Yes, people have used that term here in Saudi Arabia. We tend not to use that term, and some even find it, mildly offensive, because it's somehow, giving unearned privilege or, kudos for just being yourself. And so kind of pointing you out for something that it's just you. So we tend to shy away from that term and use people with disabilities.
No, it's an interesting one. And that term also, it reminds me of when very well-meaning people say, people with disabilities are great problem solvers. And I hope I don't get trolled for this. I hope there's not lots of bad comments on the Slido. But I always think, well, that might be true, but probably out of necessity. And actually, if we had a properly equal society where everyone got what they need, then by default, people with disabilities wouldn't have to be any better at problem solving than anybody else, because they wouldn't have those problems. But I'm taking myself down a kind of psychological rabbit hole there, so I will stop. And I will just use the opportunity to plug the language guide again. But thank you for that perspective, Kathy. Before I get tied up in knots, I'm going to come to Loic. So Loic, you're joining us from Hong Kong, and you can provide for us a North Asian perspective. So for you, from what you're seeing, is mental well-being a priority for businesses in the region, given your position negotiating with both the East and the West in the form of both China and the Western world? There's a big question for you.
Thank you, Diane, and hi, everybody. I will start by just giving a little bit of context to paint a picture for you of mental health, specifically in Hong Kong. So a lot of numbers, bear with me. If anyone needs the sources or the information, more information on the numbers, feel free to just drop me a note and I'll happily share. In Hong Kong, there are 61% of people who deem their mental health as fair, poor, or very poor. There are also 1 in 7 adults in Hong Kong who develop a common mental health disorder during their lifetime. 16% of people in Hong Kong don't talk to anyone about their feelings or symptoms. This is a real thing. 71% of people said that their jobs were the main source of mental health challenges. And for professional employees, 1 in 4 employees in Hong Kong are experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety, and 18% of them require psychological treatment. Alarming numbers, I'm sure, for everybody, myself included, but these are the sort of population and employee numbers. It also applies to students, which probably will hit even harder for some people to hear, but more than half of all secondary school students in Hong Kong have experienced, past tense, depression, and are, for most of them, unlikely to seek help. Now, why is this? Again, continuing to hopefully paint a bit of a picture. Hong Kong's a place where people typically work very long and hard jobs and hours. And I got this one number from the Federation of Labor Unions, where they survey that 60% of people work 44-hour weeks and do overtime between 5 to 8 hours. 35% of people work 50-hour weeks, and 5% work, I can't believe this, 75-hour weeks. Students too, this is more personal observation, although I'm sure there's figures and facts for it, but I'm often shocked and reminded at how comparatively easy my days are when I see students from my neighborhood who commute to and from school, and I meet them in the MTR, the tube or the metro or the train at 7 a.m. And then in the evening at 9 p.m. when I'm just returning from dinner with friends and they come back from school. And I don't mean to exaggerate, but some people might in Hong Kong might recognize this as potentially true. They may, even after 9 p.m. still have a class at home waiting for them. 60% of people also don't know where, other than in hospitals, they can seek help. And even then, Hong Kong only has half of the WHO recommended number of public sector psychiatrists, as just one example. So as you can see, that's already quite a difficult picture to appreciate. Now, as you said, Diane, culturally, what do people feel? What feelings come across people when they speak of mental health or mental illness or disability, or however you want to call it, depending on the circumstances? So more facts and figures, bear with me, please. 23% of people say that they would not be willing to work with someone who have a mental health problem. 47% of people say that they don't want to live next door to someone who has been mentally ill. Again, past tense, doesn't even have to be now. 46% believe that the main cause of mental illness is a lack of self-discipline and willpower, not a medical condition. 22% said that people with mental health problems should not be given any responsibility. 13% of people agree that people with mental illness don't deserve sympathy. And this one shocked me most because it's so personal. 1 in 3 are even willing to end friendships with those that are diagnosed with mental illness. Now, now that I painted a picture, it's sort of circled back to the question. The private and public sectors do seem aware of this, 100%. People are talking about it. And to echo some points from earlier, COVID has for sure brought along some positive changes and some awareness. There are a number of initiatives and programs. I see more and more ads in public transport and around the city as one example, and they're either promoting channels of support or messages to destigmatize mental health topics. And it's no doubt a step in the right direction. Employers are also more focused on this, though I think there's still a lot of work to do. And despite all those efforts from employers, there are still, this is from this year, 73% of employees who are unaware of any mental health support programs in their companies or provided by their employer. And 56% of these employees, or of employees in general rather, have seen mental health issues handled inappropriately in the workplace. So to kind of conclude and give an answer, a direct, short answer to your question after painting a picture, is mental health a priority for businesses here? I don't think it is yet a priority. I believe that businesses here are, for the moment at least, still in reactive mode and following demands or trends, rather than looking at this as a business priority and an area of investment with huge potential for ROI. And I'll stop there for now.
Wow, those are some stats, Loic. And when you started off with the stats around the prevalence and the 1 in 4 and 1 in 7, I was thinking, those are actually very consistent with the sorts of stats that we see in the UK, certainly. But those ones around attitude are the ones where I think kind of collective jaw drop, really. The one that really struck me was, I can't remember how many percent you said it was, but a very high percentage of people said that people with a mental health condition shouldn't be given any responsibility. So at this point, I'm going to say, as I have said before, I do have long-term depression. I take antidepressants. I love my antidepressants. And it's kind of going okay here so far, but, you know, I'll let other people be the judge of that. So, goodness me, let's hope the younger generation is going to be really pushing and changing this a bit. And we've touched on COVID as well. But kind of expanding on that bit about age differences, the McKinsey survey from this year, early this year, 2022, in sickness and in health, how health is perceived around the world, In 15 of 19 countries, a higher share of respondents aged over 65 and over rated their mental health as good or very good, compared with respondents younger than 24 who did so. And that's very consistent with other findings about Gen Z reporting lower quality of their mental health. And given what you just said, Loic, about the school regime and those hours, that does not seem that surprising. But does that resonate with you in terms of demographics?
Yes, it does. And just a small caveat, professionally, I'm not brought to interact too much or as much with Gen Z as I do with other generations, for example. So I'm more speaking on sort of personal feeling rather than fact, if that's all right. One fact for sure I pointed out earlier is over half of secondary school students have, again, past tense experienced depression. That's quite staggering. But also, yes, I do think it's more prevalent with Gen Z in what I observe. And I personally think it's maybe related to just the amount and the speed of information at their fingertips, also, which brings out the gloomy sides of maybe the world that they are living in or growing up in. And one thing that I'm a little bit worried that businesses are not taking too seriously is how much I believe the Gen Z want ownership of how and when they work. And unfortunately, here in Hong Kong, I've seen companies already starting to roll back what they'd previously done in terms of flexibility, etc. All companies, mine included, by the way, sorry guys, have already gone back to, you have to be in the office 3 days a week. Monday and Friday are mandatory. And that's for me not working positively towards how that generation wants to work, if I've understood that correctly. Maybe I haven't.
And I guess the only thing, well, not the only thing, but one of the major drivers certainly here is the skills shortages everywhere. So where employers might be wanting to say, you've got to come back and it's got to be Mondays and Fridays, if you know that people of any age actually will just say, sorry, I'm going to go somewhere where I get a better deal that suits me better, that will drive change. But on a more positive note, hopefully where Hong Kong is perhaps where some other countries were 20 years ago, and perhaps we will start to see some change, but that does feel like quite a mountain to climb. So
Hong Kong always overcomes.
Hong Kong always overcomes. Yes, okay. Well, certainly for mental health, let's hope that is the case. I won't go into other areas because we probably don't have time on this panel anyway. So kind of going on from that, and like what makes a difference. In the West, we often talk about cultural change programs like This Is Me, which encourage people to talk about disability, or particularly mental health, as part of their whole selves, just one facet of who they are rather than being their defining characteristic. This is clearly going to be problematic in Eastern cultures, I mean, particularly where you've described, Loic, where it's taboo, but also where it's just not culturally the done thing to blend personal and professional at work or in conversations. They're very much separated. So what are you doing, or what have you seen to encourage people to be open about their mental health in this context? And I'm going to come to Kathy and then Loic and then Laura.
Well, we've definitely talked about COVID a few times, right? We've brought that up. I think that has really been a catalyst to talking about mental health. But what I really notice here, and the youth, right, them really pushing it, that's a big part of it. I think in Saudi Arabia, Vision 2030 is a big part of it too. So this is a grand effort, right, to transform a lot of economic and different sectors in the kingdom, and one of those is the healthcare sector, and that includes mental health. So there's a lot more attention given to mental health services as part of Vision 2030. And it's really begun to transform the country, even, with like women driving and women not needing males' permission for certain things. Already we've seen some changes. Having people with disability, more people with disabilities in the workplace is completely linked to Vision 2030. So I think mental health too is making it more kind of mainstream to talk about and address. So I think this is one way in which the kingdom at a high level is really, like a top-down approach to it becoming more mainstream and people talking about it in the culture. They're talking about it, so other people are talking about it. the citizens are talking about it, and workplaces are following suit, I think, because of Vision 2030.
Senior leaders talking about mental health and talking about disability generally is always so powerful.
Exactly.
In what's okay to talk about here, what we're prioritizing and what's important. So that sounds like a really positive development.
Yeah, definitely.
Loic, from your point of view, I might know the answer to this given your previous.
Absolutely. Much more positive, I'll reassure you and everyone else. So within employees here, just by the way, we've also had the This Is Me movement. It was a little bit smaller perhaps and more, I think, confined to international MNCs rather than local companies. Nonetheless, it was there. What I've seen within employers, first of all, and then I'll talk about what we've done as a team, but within other employers and our clients and just around me, I've seen a growing number of companies rolling out mental health days or sometimes mental health weeks. And I've also seen a lot of new counseling channels open up to employees internally. And as was just mentioned just now, even medical insurance policies modified to include psychological support, alternative medicine support to support mental health, and so on. And I really want to talk about this because I don't see a lot of it in Hong Kong. Hopefully around the world, there's a lot more of it. But in Hong Kong, we don't talk a lot about carers, people who care for people with mental health. And what my team and I decided to do is that whenever we speak to employers or try and implement change in companies, when it comes to disability inclusion, which includes mental disability and or mental health, however you want to call or label it, we started tackling it from both, right? People who are affected personally by mental health, but also people who are caring for people with mental health. And we've seen that brings out a lot more people, a lot more energy, a lot more conversations because it's personal, it's not professional. And to your point, Diane, when you ask employees to share about their disability or reasonable workplace adjustments, like you mentioned at the beginning of today, they're like, okay, first of all, why? And what are you going to do with that information? How does that benefit me? When you talk about carers, it's personal. They're living through that at home. It's not related to the employer, but it brings out a sort of passion and a reason to discuss it within the workplace. And we've seen it can implement positive change. So all of that to say, my team and I are trying to go from both ends of that and speak about people themselves in the workplace, but also people who care for people outside the workplace.
That's really interesting, and it's really good to hear that businesses are actually leading the way in this space, as is so often the case, actually. Laura, is anything that you wanted to add on that one?
I would just say that I think that hybrid working and home working has actually helped to drive some change. I think even just when we're on our Zoom calls, we see managers, senior leaders, we get to see their homes, their personal space, their children in the background, which was very new, particularly in the Middle East. So I think that's helped to bring the personal life into the workplace. But I think what's really helped to move the dial for us is that we've had many senior leaders really role modeling and sharing their authentic stories about their own personal health. And that's really helped us to build a culture of trust. And what we're really trying to do is advocate that it's a safe space and that we want people to feel comfortable and supported to speak up. I would say one of our key initiatives is actually to educate everybody, especially our people managers, on how to identify if a colleague may be experiencing health issues. So we're trying to help them feel confident to know how to have the conversation about mental health at work, and then appropriately signpost to the support that's available, not only for their colleagues, but for themselves as well. The intention isn't that our managers are to be mental health counsellors, but really just to be able to spot the signs of anybody that's struggling and point them in the right direction to help. And we're quite fortunate at HSBC. We do have a wealth of resources and tools. We have an EAP, we have a global wellbeing hub, we have free access to a wellbeing app, and the list goes on. So I think all of this collectively has really just helped to, it's just really helped to change the culture.
That's really good to hear. And of course, culture is so key in everything, but so key around mental health, and empowering managers to have the confidence to have the conversation is vital. I wanted to come to each of you, and I'm aware that time is very tight. So like one sentence each on a message that you would like to give people listening to this. So Kathy first.
I might have to do 3 sentences.
Okay.
So one is collecting data, right? The importance of collecting data and seeing where your workforce is or where your organization is. And as part of that, I think we've really pointed to, without saying it explicitly, the importance of taking an intersectional lens as far as age, as far as culture, as far as gender, right? So not just looking overall at groups, but looking at those intricacies as well. And just one little thing too that I've been thinking a lot about, especially where there's a lot of expats, like in Dubai, or other countries, or a lot of people from different cultures or different countries, is the societal events that are happening in those countries and how that might be affecting people in those cultures. So I'm thinking of Iran, for example. So our Iranian employees, how are they faring? Or if there's another school shooting in the US, how are we faring? Those kinds of things. So culture, and not just kind of cultural background, but what's happening in that person's culture or that group's culture that might be affecting them in the workplace that's different from other people who aren't from that culture. So intersectionality, I guess, is my plug.
It's a very good plug. Thank you for that, Kathy. Laura, final thought from you.
In one sentence, I would say get a senior leader, sponsor to champion the importance of mental well-being.
Thank you, totally. Loic?
I wanted to ask organizations to start and to be bold. If organizations take bold actions now by investing in the mental health of their people, they will, as continuously demonstrated around the world, enjoy strong ROIs and no doubt outshine their competitors in the current struggle for talent.
Thank you, Loic. And finally, a last quick thought from you, Ange.
I'll give a researcher's quick thought. I would say don't over-rely on numerical data about your workforce only. Make sure your managers can notice when someone needs to rest, when someone is not okay, when someone might be struggling. So notice as well as collect data, and don't use your data above noticing.
Thank you, Ange. Some great nuggets there. And we are out of time now. So thank you very much to all our panelists for a rich and very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you, Loic. Thank you, Ange. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Laura. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And we now go back to the rest of our conference. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Slightly unbelievably, that marks the end of our first session for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I did say it was a game of two halves, and we did mention the football. So we've covered a lot of ground in just under or coming up for 3 hours, from language to the language of loss. And I wrote down that people are now recalibrating who they are and what they want out of life. That's big stuff. That's life-changing, transformational stuff. And changing what's important, and hopefully being able to hang on to some of that. I really enjoyed speaking with John, as I hope you could tell, and I think he exemplifies the kind of leader that we all need right now, that humble leader, that transparent leader, that out the front transformational leader that is really standing up to be counted. And I loved some of the things he said around a just transition, and also power and proximity. He's incredibly quotable, and I very much look forward to continuing that conversation with him. And of course, Aidan, as always, gave us a masterclass, albeit a short one because of time constraints, in neurodiversity, and I love that he always rightly focuses on strengths and also encourages us and encourages managers and encourages employees to focus on barriers and removing them, and not to get caught up in a medical definition or diagnosis, because so often those labels can be what scare people. And we came back into language again in that one, in neurodiversity versus disability, which is why I think our language guide wants to start a conversation rather than professing to have all the answers. So before we close, I wanted to share a few of the things that we're doing with you, a few reminders, and to let you know what's coming up next. So as I mentioned just now and earlier, we have now launched our brand new guide, Lost in Translation, a global guide to the language of disability, sponsored by HSBC. And as I mentioned, for those of you looking for a magic bullet or definitive answer on language, I'm afraid there isn't one. Rather, the guide encourages you to start a conversation with your customers and employees to develop a narrative together that works for you. And the really important thing is starting that conversation. So as I mentioned, you can find the guide freely available on our Knowledge Hub for the next month, and there is a link to it in the chat. I really hope you find it useful. A reminder too that last month, we can say last month now, it's December, we launched a comprehensive new online toolkit around sight loss. This toolkit was commissioned and funded by Roche Products Limited, and it aims to educate business, both as employers and service providers, on how to remove barriers relating to sight loss. It's got lots of information and advice on recruiting, retaining and serving employees and customers with sight loss and making reasonable adjustments. And it does also include sections for clinicians and healthcare professionals with a focus on, you've guessed it, use of language, as well as advice for people with sight loss. And that one is also freely available to everyone on our Knowledge Hub, and the link should also be in the chat. We have also just today launched our Great Big Workplace Adjustment Survey 2023, sponsored by our partner Microlink. You may remember our previous survey back in 2019 shone a light on the experience of 1,200 disabled employees in getting and asking for adjustments in the workplace. Now, post, or at least alongside COVID, we are repeating the survey to look at what's changed and what hasn't. You can find the link to the survey in the chat. Please do share with your teams, with your employees. The more responses we get, the richer and more informative the data will be. And we'll be launching the results at a virtual event with Microlink CEO Nasa Siabi and our very own Angela Matthews, who is leading that research, on the 9th of March 2023. And Microlink are also kindly sponsoring our Disability Smart Awards 2023, and they're now open, so please get entering. And don't be shy. I hear of loads of really great and innovative practice in conversations with you and with my team. So please share what you're doing, and you never know, you might be a winner. I'm also very pleased that we'll be holding an in-person awards ceremony on the 27th of April for the first time since 2019, thanks to our generous hosts, Freshfields. And a very early date for your diary is our next annual conference, which will take place on the 28th of June, sponsored by our partner, NatWest. I think that's all the plugs. So it just remains for me to say a few thank yous. First, a huge thank you once again to HSBC for your support in making this event possible. And particular thanks to our speaker, Carolanne Minashi, for your leadership in this space. Thank you to all our guest speakers and panelists, Jean Tennant, Monica Jankowska-Rangeloff, Lynn Lee, Srila Dasgupta, John McAlalisi, Aidan Healy, Loic Andre, Angela Matthews, Kathy Miner, and Laura Frost. Thank you to our brilliant hosts, Mary Worsley and Daniel Cadey. And thank you to our BDF team who have been hard at work behind the scenes making this all happen, particularly our events team, Bella, George and John, and our marketing and creative teams, Lara, Elodie, Anthony and Chris. Thanks to My Clear Text, Heather Casserly and Patricia Atherton for your fabulous captioning. Thank you to Benjamin Gorman and Patragun Ne Ragilich for providing BSL at today's event. Thanks to Dan Dexter and Mark Breacher for producing today's live event. And last but not least, thanks to you all for coming and listening and participating. I really hope you enjoyed it and found something you can take away to put into practice in your own organisation. We'd love to know what you thought of today and what you'd like more of. We'll be sharing a link to a short promise survey. A link to the survey is being shared with you now and will be sent by email afterwards. So it just remains for me to wish you a very happy United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities on Saturday. And I very much look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.